Are age gap relationships the result of mother and father wounds? What does neuroscience tell us? And what attachment styles usually end up in age gap relationships? This was a question that continuously came up throughout the personal development school. And I decided to dig in a little bit further to the data. And I will tell you, the answer literally shocked me. So in today's video, we are going to talk about the neuroscience of age gap relationships. We'll break it down by each attachment style's viewpoints of age gap relationships at the end, so you can see who tends to be more interested or attracted to age gap relationships. And we will talk about both gender playing a role and attachment style playing a role. But in order to do that, we have to start by defining what age gap relationships actually are. Hello and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Gibson. And after about 14 years of being in private practice and working in our online group coaching programs at the Personal Development School, I am here to share with you the most powerful insights about deep inner healing from your childhood and the neuroscience of how you can rewire toxic patterns, painful cycles, so that you can live your best life. Now, most sources use the concept of age gap relationships to mean a couple where there's essentially a larger than typical difference in age, but one where there isn't necessarily a universal cutoff. So from a psychological point of view, it's essentially a relationship with a 10 plus year difference in order to qualify. Of course, though, this exists along a continuum, as with most things. And of course, it's important to note that different countries, different cultures will have a different experience here, but we're talking specifically about the Western world. Are age gap relationships about having mother or father wounds? We're going to get into it. And in order to do so, we have to first study a little bit of the data and reports about people in age gap relationships. According to an Ipsos poll in 2024, about half of American adults report having been in a relationship at some point in their lives with a 10-year plus age gap. Younger partners were reported, this is independent of attachment style, by the way, as bringing more energy or attractiveness to the relationship, while older partners bringing more emotional maturity and financial stability. Okay, so this was according to a massive poll in 2024 about people's opinions, irrespective of attachment style, on just age gap relationships as a whole. Number two, a YouGov study in 2018, a very large US poll, found that most people preferred a moderate age gap. Only about 9% of people reported saying that an age gap of more than 20 years was what they would consider acceptable. That means 91% of people were against an age gap of that size. And according to the Pew Research Center in 2024, in actual US marriages, the average age gap is only about 2.2 years. Big age gaps are much less common than often social media may make it think. But who gets into age gap relationships according to attachment style? And why? Another study found that about 22% of people in age gap relationships self-report having mother issues or daddy issues. And I would say that this reflects roughly what I've seen in my personal practice. As somebody who's literally spent far over a decade working with people, seeing tens of thousands of clients, either in our online group coaching programs at the Personal Development School or one-to-one or in couples, I would generally see a pattern that really was about, I would say, maybe 25% here. Now, this isn't a good or a bad thing in and of itself. And I really believe this. I don't believe there's a right or wrong answer or one size fits all for anybody. I think very much that each thing in our lives as human beings is a relationship. We have a relationship to our relationships. We have a relationship to our friendships. We have a relationship to food and how we eat. We have a relationship to our body and how we move or sleep. We have a relationship to our careers and to money. And I very much think how our relationship is to the idea of an age gap relationship means everything. See, if you're using an age gap relationship to fill something inside of yourself that you're not healing, so maybe you feel like you can't succeed in the world out on your own. And so as a result of that, you use a relationship to fill this void of perceived financial stability or financial capability in yourself, then that's where we may have some problems because we're operating from lack rather than wholeness and self-belief. And on top of that, if we use age gap relationships to fill this lack of nurturing that we had growing up, and we don't know how yet to nurture ourselves and get to know ourselves in a meaningful way, then of course, there will be downsides to this. But if we're using an age gap relationship because it makes sense, because we fell in love with a person, and because we're operating from the state of wholeness within ourselves, then of course, there isn't anything wrong with this. And I will just say before we get into this, if you are somebody who does have a mother or father wound from previous experiences in your own childhood, I will say that we have really in-depth healing courses about the mother and father wound. And you can check that out fully for free for 7 days while you check out our all access pass. class, but just for this month as a giveaway, you also get to keep our Somatic Experiencing and Nervous System Regulation course for free for life. So it is a gift. It has really powerful tools for regulating your nervous system, increasing your window of tolerance, and doing some really deep healing. And I'll put the link to that down below. Here's the argument for age gap relationships. So there's a really interesting study done that I found to be one of the most comprehensive studies in the Journal of Evolutionary Behavioral Science by Sarah Skeltonberry and Darren Fowler. And the study was called Attachment Styles of Women Younger Partners in Age Gap Relationships. Now, the argument here for the age gap relationship was that women have evolved biologically to seek an older mate. However, research has shown negative opinions towards these relationships if the age gap is significant. The most popular opinion is that women who date men that are 10 or more years their senior have an unhealthy relationship to their father. So the study really sought to figure out whether or not that's true. And it was specifically around women, by the way. So women who end up in relationships with older men, was this about having daddy issues, essentially? Now, the common belief that women choose an older partner because of daddy issues was largely unfounded in this study. There was no significant difference between the two groups. And in fact, 74% of women in age gap relationships were securely attached. I found this to be really interesting. And it also mirrors that inverse relationship with that 22% of people who reported having mother or father issues and citing that may be a reason why they were attracted to other relationships. But the majority of women in these age gap relationships were actually securely attached. And so the authors explicitly noted that the stereotype that women in age gap relationships having daddy issues is not supported. Now, I found that to be super interesting, but I want to go into some general reports of each attachment style's views in age gap relationships and a sort of general consensus you'll often hear by attachment style. And we'll break it down by both men and women. And I want to ask you, before we even get into this part, because I find this to be the most interesting part of the video, what was your feeling or thought coming into watching this video? Did you generally think that age gap relationships were healthy or unhealthy? Did you see benefits or drawbacks? What did you imagine was going to be the output or experience of each attachment style and why? And in some of this, you might actually find yourself not being as surprised, but some of it you might be. Okay, so we're going to break down by both men and women according to each attachment style. Dismissive avoidant men, okay, and I'm curious what your guess is as I get into this, generally reported viewing age gap relationships where the man was older and the woman was younger, and this is in heterosexual relationships. This was the data and reporting that they did, that they reported feeling more positive in age gap relationships. And dismissive avoidant women actually reported being more neutral to positive at around 52%. On the other hand, anxiously attached women in relationships reported viewing this as more positive to neutral. So again, very close to that 50% mark. And anxious preoccupied men, interestingly, found this to be slightly negative. Okay. And here's my synopsis or inference as to why. I think that anxiously attached women and dismissive avoidant men tend to have a degree of trying to fill what they feel is missing because they're still insecurely attached when it comes to age gap relationships. And so I think that there is this positive view in certain points for that reason. Whereas I think anxious preoccupied men with younger women have a greater feeling or fear of abandonment. So they tend to fear being abandoned more. And that's my inference as to why this broke from the pattern for dismissive avoidant men and women and anxious preoccupied women. So let's break this down by attachment style and gender. Dismissive avoidant men reported viewing this as something more positive. I think that there's a pretty easy inference we can make about this, which is probably that dismissive avoidant men, as a general rule, don't want to feel like they meet somebody and there is a rush to commit to things, a rush to have kids. I think that dismissive avoidant men generally tend to emotionally mature a little bit later, and to have that runway or time is very likely to be a more positive thing according to their conditioning, or at least a slightly more positive thing. And I will say they didn't report it being this, it wasn't like 80-20. It was positive neutral. Okay. So not this huge report there, but I found that to be interesting and it made sense to me. Dismissive avoidant women, on the other hand, were very close. So they actually reported at 52% seeing age gap relationships as more positive. So you're a lot closer to that center point there. Anxious preoccupied women, on the other hand, viewed age gap relationships as positive neutral. So again, seeing a slight positive shift and range in terms of how they saw age gap relationships. And I do believe that there's a sense here of anxious preoccupied women caring about that stability and maturity of the partner, and also looking for a longer term commitment. And a lot of anxious, preoccupied women actually report having a better experience with age gap relationships as well, which I find to be significant. Probably again, because somebody who's a little bit older and emotionally more mature does have the capacity to maybe be there and co regulate better with an anxious, preoccupied partner. Again, I'm just making these inferences. That wasn't part of this reporting. Anxious, preoccupied men, on the other hand, reported seeing age gap relationships as being neutral to negative. Okay, so they're actually skewed on the negative side in their perceptions of age gap relationships. And I very much believe that this is because anxious, preoccupied men, especially because we're talking heterosexual relationships in this data, I very much believe that anxious, preoccupied men tend to fear that the younger partner may lose interest or be more likely to abandon them, which I think they find to be a little bit more fearful or threatening. Okay, so that's my inference, but it would not surprise me. Then fearful, avoidant men and women both reported age gap relationships as being more negative. Okay, they thought of this as being a more negative thing. And I very much believe this is going to be because of potential trust issues in relationships. And I can say this as somebody who at one point was fearful avoidant attachment style and did a lot of the work. If you don't know, much about me or my story, hello and welcome. But as somebody who did a lot of the work, when I was fearful avoidant, I definitely, when I saw age gap relationships, thought, oh, people are sort of using the relationship to fill their needs rather than developing a relationship based on bonding and connection, which looking back on that now, I can definitely see it's coming from a place of woundedness because your age really shouldn't dictate that. But I will just say that was my general perception at the time, if I'm being fully transparent. And I'm curious how many of you as fearful avoidants may have that fear. I think that fearful avoidants very much want to feel like a relationship is based on the level and degree of connection and chemistry and depth. And I think view age or different generations as being almost like a barrier to that in a sense as well. Interestingly enough, securely attached individuals actually skewed positive to neutral. And so what we saw is that there was a slight positive skew towards securely attached individuals viewing age gap relationships as being a more positive thing. That is your quick summary on age gap relationships, according to different reporting from many, many places. But I hope you enjoyed today's video and this was educational for you. I put daily videos here all about attachment styles, healing, rewiring our attachment style. This was more of a reporting type of video here today, but if you enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our exciting videos. And also every Saturday morning at 11:30 a.m., Mike DeZio and I do a live stream to talk all about attachment challenges in depth. You can come in, ask any questions that you have, and would love to see you there. Thanks for watching.